The ungovernables, the ferocious, the conscienceless, the idiots. Don't punish them, kill, 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 kill them. This course is really different. We study this aspect of things, this dimension of things. We need to see things in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The atomic theory did something different. What you're telling me is the world as I perceive it isn't very much like the way the world really is at all. So we're gonna see some great ideas, some that I think you should be inspired by. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they're endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. We're gonna see some wild ideas that I think you should be shocked by and horrified by. Shaw said if we desire a certain type of civilization and culture, we must exterminate the sort of people who don't fit in. The majority of men at present in Europe have no business to be alive. We're in a new circumstance, but the problems we face are really not new. They're problems that we've been facing for the last several centuries. Benda said our age is becoming the age of the intellectual organization of political hatreds. We are heading for the greatest and most perfect war ever seen in the world. Understanding how we've been grappling with those gives us the tools we need to deal with them today. Hello. This is a course on ideas of the 20th century. Now, what is such a course? It's an odd interdisciplinary thing. Really, it's a throwback to an old style of humanities course of the kind that would have been part of Yale's directed studies program or civilization programs at a variety of universities. Sort of fell out of fashion a number of years ago, but I think it's really unfortunate that it did. Because what I'm going to try to do is trace certain themes in philosophy, literature, history, and art, and see how they combine together to give us an understanding of the problems faced by an entire century. Now, why should we care about that? Partly because the 20th century is how we got here. The problems that the 20th century faced are, I'm going to argue, problems stemming from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. They're fundamental problems. We really haven't resolved them yet. But looking at the ways in which they shaped the 20th century and the ways in which people tried to solve them, I think helps us understand both the nature of the problems and also the range of possible solutions. So we're going to be looking at these various themes, and I'm going to be jumping back and forth between history, philosophy, literature, art, and occasionally other things, trying to understand the way in which these themes fit together. Now, part of the idea here is that things that happen in the real world do affect the world of ideas, but also the world of ideas affects what really goes on in the world. And so these aren't entirely separate areas. They have to be understood together. And when you get into a university of a traditional kind, people are split into departments. The philosophers just do philosophy. The historians just do history, and so on. And you don't get many people who are looking at the interactions and the ways in which ideas shape history or vice versa. So that's what this course is all about, trying to understand what I've described here as a mighty maze. The way in which all of these things fit together and suggest that there are certain problems that a civilization is trying to solve. And I think there are some very basic problems that the 20th century was trying to address. To understand them, we need to go back to the scientific revolution, and in particular, the aspects of it that ended up reshaping people's lives in the agricultural and industrial revolutions. If you had been born before 1750, the odds were strong that your life was going to follow much the same pattern of your parents' and grandparents' lives, even your ancestors from hundreds or thousands of years before. Almost everybody was involved in farming and struggling to survive, struggling to find enough food to really put a meal on the table for that night and maybe that week. But things changed in the scientific revolution. Partly our understanding of nature became much more sophisticated, but partly that transformed technology, that changed human relationships. So starting in the 18th century, in developed countries at least, was the agricultural revolution. And it really changed the way that society was organized. And then we have two industrial revolutions in the 19th century, and they reshape things in fundamental ways. Now, in part, they just set up the tremendous transformations of the 20th century. in transportation, mass production, mass communication, and so on. So we're all familiar with that. And in fact, just in my lifetime, there have been huge transformations in technology. But the formative era of that was really in the centuries before. So let's start with the agricultural revolution. It was something that, in a certain sense, started even in the medieval period and then got waylaid by the Black Plague and other things. But over several centuries, a number of innovations came about that made it much easier to grow more food. So crop rotation in part, the curved wheelless plow, new crops such as potatoes and corn that enabled people to grow crops on land that had been unarable before, property rights and enclosures that enabled people to actually have stable farming, selective breeding so that they could actually shift the way that animals were bred to make them more useful for humans. And then the seed drill, which actually allowed people to plant seeds at the right distance from each other and at the right depth. All of that led to immensely increased crop yields. There were slow improvements throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods, but then starting around 1750, huge advances. Now, what did that mean? Well, there was more food available at lower prices. It took less labor, much less labor actually, to produce that amount of food. And so there were lots of people who found that suddenly they weren't needed on farms anymore. They tended to go to towns and go to cities, and that made them available for other kinds of activities. There was more money for other things, more money available for investment, for example, in factories and other things that would shape the Industrial Revolution. There were improvements in transportation. It was important now to actually be able to bring the food to the towns because it wasn't all being consumed in those rural communities. So people had to build more roads, and transportation thus became easier in general. Well, what happened over the 19th century as a result of this is that 60% of the population went from the countryside to cities and towns. They weren't needed on the farms anymore. And so they gravitated to areas where there were other people. So in 1800, 4 out of 5 people worked in farming. By 1900, it was only 1 out of 5. 3 out of 5 people ended up moving to the cities. Now that's part of the story. Part of this was a matter of conceptual advances. John Locke developed a theory of property that enabled people to say, this is mine. Rousseau denounced this and said, the first person to rope off a plot of land and say, this is mine, and find people fool enough to believe him was the true founder of civil society. Well, Locke thought that was a good thing, okay? Because what it meant is you could invest in your land. You could actually buy things like a seed drill and a new fancy plow that was more effective. If you were farming somebody else's property, you didn't have much incentive, really, to improve things.
Imagine your favorite lecture. Dial that up on max, put that on steroids, and then add some cinematic elements to it. That's the best way I could describe a Peterson Academy lecture.
I went to college because I had to. I go to Peterson Academy because I want to. I'm still paying off college from 10 years ago, and I'm also still questioning the value that I got out of college.
In traditional universities, a lot of times it's just pretty dry. They don't bring the same energy as the professors at Peterson Academy.
And it is a completely different experience to learn from somebody who actually wants to teach you.
If you've been on the fence about this is the time.
That thing that's calling to you, you won't have an answer for it unless you enroll and see for yourself. You have the opportunity to investigate that calling.
But if it was yours and you were producing things that you could then sell, there were tremendous incentives to actually develop things and use this new technology. The result of that has been a tremendous improvement in health, well-being, and prosperity, really all throughout the world. Initially in Western Europe and the United States, but gradually spreading throughout the rest of the world. Now, what happened when people moved into the cities is that they needed things to do, and suddenly there was capital available for investment. There were a series of inventions that transformed the way people lived. First of all, Edmund Cartwright invented the power loom. Instead of having to sew clothes by hand, suddenly they were being mass-produced. The price of clothing fell dramatically. And here you see the increase over a few years in power looms, went from insignificant, really non-existent in 1800, insignificant by 1813, but widespread in common use by 1850. putting weavers and other people who did all this by hand out of business to a large extent, but nevertheless making clothing available at much lower prices for many people. James Watt invented the steam engine, which transformed transportation and a variety of other areas. In 1800, it was capable of producing 10,000 horsepower. I mean, initially, his machine was large, very large actually, and didn't do much. But by 1850, it was producing 1.3 million horsepower. So that was tremendous and a kind of force that was inconceivable in earlier ways. That made possible steamships, which were far more effective than sailing ships, and locomotives. The first one, again, primitive in 1804, it went 5 miles an hour. By 1830, 16 miles an hour. Now, that doesn't sound impressive to us, but when you were comparing it to walking or even a horse, that was pretty good. By 1850, 50 miles an hour. And not long after that, even higher speeds. The result of that was a huge popularity of railways for people to transport themselves and to transport goods. And so by 1850, there were already 6,000 miles of track in Great Britain alone. Well, corresponding to all of that was an even greater movement to the cities. London grew from 1 million to almost 2.5 million. There were no cities in Europe under 1 million, but over 100,000. In 1800, by 1850, there were 9 of them, and many cities that were almost that size. Now, think about what it was like to work in these factories that were popping up in all sorts of towns and cities. It was, in a way, terrible. 12 to 16-hour days. Terrible conditions, noxious fumes, high temperatures. It was very dangerous. A couple of my own great-grandfathers actually died as a result of industrial accidents. So it was hard working in those mills. And in addition, when such a flux of people went into the cities, the result of that was a humanitarian disaster in a way. The cities were overcrowded. There was no plumbing. There was sewage in the street, garbage everywhere. The result of that was widespread disease, cholera epidemic after cholera epidemic. So conditions looked bad. But on the other hand, some people were getting rich as a result of this, and lots of people were actually making money to a degree that had been impossible before. Not just the rich, but a growing middle class. So it wasn't just because people had jobs in these factories that improved their income. It was easier than working on well, not easier, but more lucrative, let's say, than working on the farms. But in addition, it made the goods that they were buying so much less expensive. Before that, just owning clothes was a difficult thing. You might have a couple of outfits, one that you would wear while the other was being washed. But after that, clothing was much less expensive, so was food, and so you could live much better on even the same income. The result of that was increased trade, increased travel, these increases in income and wealth that started leading to a kind of public culture that became perfected by the end of the century. Now, the second industrial revolution, to a large extent, made those problems of the first industrial revolution seem much easier to deal with. How? Well, first of all, it left much larger groups of people with discretionary income. So it spread wealth around a much larger section of the population. It increased productivity hugely, which meant the factory jobs were no longer quite so terrible. Working hours and working conditions were better. And people started thinking in terms of what they wanted, not just what they needed. And so instead of thinking, how am I going to get food? How am I going to get clothing? People actually were able to start thinking, what would I actually like? What would make my life better? So how did this happen? Well, first of all, the Industrial Revolution had progressed to a point where now the clothing, the food, the other products were starting to become much more widely available. Prices were falling. And there was also dramatic population growth. The population of Europe almost doubled. Now, why? It was not so much a matter of people moving in. It wasn't really an increased birth rate. It was a declining rate of death. There were huge advances in medicine, in particular, the germ theory of disease. We take that for granted, but it was a new idea. And also, a huge driver of civilization, plumbing. So, first of all, the germ theory. Ignaz Semmelweis was a physician who was convinced that there was some explanation for why, in this wing of the hospital, women were getting sick and dying after childbirth at a much higher rate than in this wing. And after an intensive study, he realized it's because in this wing, doctors are going into the morgue, studying, and then going right in to deliver babies without washing their hands. Astounding to us, but he insisted that doctors wash their hands. They thought he was crazy. I mean, imagine, no, there are these little things and you got to get rid of these little things that you cannot see. They thought he was mad. They put him in an insane asylum where he was beaten to death by the guards. They were convinced the guy was crazy and he kept telling them to wash their hands and so on. But he was, of course, right about all of this. Pasteur realized that he was right and actually came up with ways of pasteurizing milk and all sorts of other things to make them safer. So it wasn't just a matter of treating diseases and preventing diseases better. It was also changing the way we dealt with the food supply to make problems much less serious. This led to all sorts of other advances. In 1750, only about a third of babies survived birth. By 1900, it was 85%. Now it's almost 100%. The changes in population were huge. First of all, because there was such an influx into the cities, and because factories were growing so much and things were prospering, there was massive immigration. People started moving not only from the countryside to the cities, but also from country to country to take advantage of increased opportunities. London by 1900 had grown to 6.5 million. Remember, it had started the century at just 1 million. So that's tremendous growth. And by now there were lots of European cities, over 100,000. The same thing was happening in the United States. Chicago, for example, was a town of fewer than 30,000. In 1850, by 1900, it was a city of 1.7 million. New York grew from about 500,000 to over 2 million. And maybe most astoundingly, Cleveland was a tiny town of 17,000. It had almost 400,000 people by the turn of the century. So tremendous growth in all of these cities, not only due to internal movement into the cities, but also due to immigration. Part of the story here was the advent of the steel industry. It was minor in 1860. By 1913, 32 million tons were being produced in Western Europe alone. Then came electricity and the way in which it transformed our lives through lighting, Thomas Edison, but also in all sorts of other ways. Nikola Tesla invented alternating current and induction motors, wireless communication, remote controls. So thank you, Tesla. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Edison invented the phonograph. Marconi invented the wireless telegraph. Marconi, the radio. All of these things taking place within a span of 20 or 25 years. So astounding advances in ways that were totally going to reshape civilization. Similar things were happening in transportation. The first bicycle was in 1886. That's not that long ago. And it wasn't long before Ford and others invented the internal combustion engine. That was the first Ford motor car in 1896. Doesn't look like much, but within just 7 years, the first flight in Kitty Hawk. So an astounding progress that has reshaped the way in which human societies are organized in the 20th century. It also changed economically the way these societies were structured. There was steady, large increases in income, the rise of the middle class. National incomes were up 2 to 3 times. Real wages for the average person doubled. And working hours, but still long by our standards, 5.5 days, usually 10-hour days, but still much better than they had been a few years before. There were lower prices, and this was the era of national product brands, of shopping districts, of department stores, of large manufacturing plants. So a lot of things we take for granted now were really innovations right around 1900. Another innovation was mass, free primary education. All of a sudden, people realized it's very important that we have an educated citizenry. Why? Well, partly because before that, religious organizations, churches, synagogues, etc., were largely responsible for education, and much of it took place in the home. But there was a sense that people of different religious backgrounds needed to get together, so we needed a more secular version of education. People wanted skilled labor. It took skills to work in factories that weren't required on the farm. people wanted people to participate in politics, to be part of a republic, a democracy, and so we needed people to actually be informed. There was an idea that we had to shape people coming from all over the world into the United States in particular, but it was happening in Europe too, and shape that into a country, give people a feeling of patriotism and a common culture. And as a result of all that, literacy became almost universal throughout the Western world. There was a huge need for teachers, and so this led to the rise of women's colleges to train teachers. It was also the era of mass circulation, magazines, newspapers, a rise of popular culture, and then music halls, vaudeville, team sports, things where you had enough people now in cities to enable these kinds of cultural activities. So all of that, the agricultural revolution and then the two industrial revolutions, really changed the nature of not only the way the average person lived, but the whole structure of society. Now, why do I stress all this? Because it really gave a set of problems and a huge set of advantages to the 20th century. But it meant suddenly in the 20th century, the way you were living was really different from the way your grandparents lived. And that was a new thing in civilization. Maybe if we go back to the Roman Empire, we would find something like this, but not nearly to this extent. All of a sudden, the life that most of us lead now would have been inconceivable to our great-grandparents. And so how did that happen? And what kinds of problems did it face us with? You might think, look, it's a huge advantage. I would not want to go back to living in 1700. Even if I were very wealthy, I would want things like indoor plumbing and antibiotics and other things. And so there is a huge advantage to this. I don't mean to downplay that. But on the other hand, there are reasons why people predicted that the 20th century would be a century of great wars. And it was. 100 million people died in world wars. Another 100 million died at the hands of their own governments. And so at the time you might have thought we finally achieved this wonderful state of near universal prosperity, and we have a recipe for spreading it to the rest of the world. All of a sudden, all sorts of problems arose. Why? Well, let's take a look in the realm of ideas at the 19th century's legacies. The first has to do with the role of reason and a kind of controversy about it. Plato had the idea that the soul was something like a driver of a chariot. Okay, in the driver's seat in the chariot was reason, but there were two horses that had to be controlled. One of them was emotion, and the other was desire. Emotion usually played along with reason. How you feel about something and how you think about it are closely related. But desire was something that was hard to control. And so in the images you see in Plato and artworks that depict this, it's the horse of desire that is rebelling and that reason is struggling to maintain control of. The idea here is that reason gives us a way to actually live in the proper fashion. It allows us to understand the world, and we need to get desire and emotion under control. So rationality becomes the key thing. And indeed, through the scientific revolution and then these technological advances, it looked as if huge confirmation for this idea that reason is the right way to live. It is the path to progress. So take a look, for example, at the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who writes about Sherlock Holmes. That's his most famous character. And right at the beginning of an early story, A Scandal in Bohemia, Watson is describing Holmes and introducing him to us for the first time. He says all emotions, and that one particularly, in this case love, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine the world has seen. Now notice, emotion, utterly foreign to Holmes. His mind is absolutely balanced, a perfect reasoning machine. It reflects that Platonic ideal. It's all about reason, and reason controlling desire, controlling emotion. For the trained reasoner to admit such intrusions as desire or emotion into his delicate and finely adjusted temperament was to introduce a distracting factor which might throw a doubt on all his mental results. So to make progress, we really need to keep reason in control, keep everything else suppressed and utterly reined in. Now, there is an issue that emerges in the 19th century. It becomes a key issue throughout the 20th century. And initially, it's very surprising. But I think I can understand why it arises. and also why it poses such a problem. You would think that, given the emphasis on reason, given these technological advances, scientific advances, a tremendously better understanding of the world, we would say, okay, here's what's going on. The world is the way it is. It's independent of our minds. We can't just make this up. Science is hard work. But eventually we figure out what's really going on in the world. We do it by the use of reason. And at that point, we've discovered some of these mind-independent truths, these things that are really true about the world, no matter what people happen to think about them. That seems to utterly contradict the thought that things are mind-dependent. The idealist, in philosophical terms, says that everything is mind-dependent. There are no mind-independent facts. And initially, that's a really surprising sort of claim. Why would somebody think that? I mean, it's obvious that some things are mind-dependent. If I say, hey, I'm thinking about such and such, that's a fact that depends on what's going on in my mind. So sure, lots of things are dependent on minds when we talk about psychology or just our ordinary experiences. But everything? Surely science is giving us a picture of a mind-independent world. And that's what the realist says. Now, here's why this becomes such a critical issue. First of all, if I apply this to my own life, I've got a question, and a question that was made much more acute by the scientific revolution, because it looks as if the picture of the world that we get through science is a pretty complete picture of the world. And if you think that, you might think, I don't know where there's any room left for example, God. And so the French encyclopedias, especially, were tempted to say, science has shown us, we don't need God. Okay, we have no need for that hypothesis. We can just understand the world in its own terms, period. Well, if we think that, you might think, what does that make me? And what do I do then in living my own life? Am I to guide my own life without anything external to me that guides me? Or is there really something external to me that I have to live up to? So it matters whether I think that I am the source of all value, of right and wrong and good and evil and just and unjust, or whether I think there's something outside of me that determines all that and I have to live up to that. So at one level, we're thinking about the world and the way we perceive it and whether that's really independent of our minds in a way that would be described by science. But part of it is, what is science leaving out? If all we have is science, then what becomes of me? And what becomes of God? What becomes of goodness and justice and things like that? So am I free to assign my life any meaning I want? Maybe I can say, hey, this is the way I live. This is just my thing. And I'm answerable only to myself. Or maybe I'm answerable to something else, something higher. Now, this is true in politics as well. So it's not just a personal question. Whatever's true of me is also true for us here. Are we able to assign meaning and value however we like? Or are we, as a society, answerable to something higher? Richard Fernandez has put it this way, arguing for realism, by the way. The key idea behind civilization, and indeed all progress, is that there is something out there that represents the truth. It exists independently of us. We cannot simply make it up. Once that is grasped, all else is detail. The most critical part of political theory lies in acknowledging that human institutions are not the ultimate sources of authority. They live within the world of the unread book. And that becomes a key question throughout the 20th century. Are we the ultimate sources of authority, or do we live in the world of the unread book? Is there something outside of us to which we have to answer? That is really fundamental, and we're going to see people on both sides, but it becomes one of the things that drives the world wars that end up dominating so much of 20th century history. Now, in Doyle's story, to return to Sherlock Holmes for a moment, there's a key thing that happens, and photography plays a critical role. And I think it's worth reflecting on that because Doyle thinks, I think, that this is hugely important, okay? The king comes and talks to Sherlock Holmes and says, listen, I had this love affair long in my past, somewhat scandalous, and now it may mess up my plan to marry this other person for great political advantage if this comes out. And there are letters, and it could be bad for me. Maybe I could be blackmailed. And Sherlock Holmes is puzzled. He says, I fail to follow your majesty. If this young person should produce her letters for blackmailing or other purposes, how is she to prove their authenticity? He says, there is the writing. Poof, poof, forgery. My private notepaper, stolen. My own seal, imitated. My photograph, bought. We were both in the photograph. Oh dear, says Holmes, that's very bad. Your majesty has indeed committed an indiscretion. Now why? Why is the photograph so damaging? What's special about photography? Well, think about, in general, what it means. Suppose somebody had written a story, a book even, about this affair of the king with someone else years ago. Well, fiction, right? That doesn't prove a thing. What if someone paints a painting showing this scandalous affair? Again, well, just imagination. Okay? There's something special about a camera that makes photography different. There's a reason why we put cameras at finish lines to determine who really won the race, rather than, let's say, writers or painters. That would not work at all. It wouldn't be evidence, but a photograph is evidence. And that's not to say photographs always depict the world exactly the way it is. Here is an image of Doyle that's double exposed, so he didn't really have that weird halo around his head. So photographs can go wrong, but still there is a causal process operating here, and the normal outcome of it is to represent things accurately. That's why we use cameras, to actually show you who won the race. Or we take a photograph, or at least did before Photoshop and all sorts of other AI tools that indicated this really happened. Okay, we've got a photograph of it. Well, the realist thinks perception is the same way. When it functions normally, it shows you the world the way it is. It produces an accurate representation. Does it sometimes go wrong? Well, sure, but there's a similar causal process, and when things operate normally, it works. So I think stemming from the Enlightenment, a dominant attitude throughout the 19th century and surviving into the 20th are four theses that I think of as the basic theses of the Enlightenment and that depict a realist view of the world. The first is a thesis about truth. There are truths that are absolute, independent of mind, and universal. A good example, the truths of mathematics. Another, basic truths of science, forces, mass times acceleration, and other scientific laws that look like they are truths, they describe the way the world is. They are independent of any individual mind. They apply universally. Secondly, it's possible to have objective knowledge of at least some of them. We do have mathematical knowledge. We do have scientific knowledge. And we have common sense knowledge, like saying, I have a hand. Okay, that's objectively true. And so we can know some things objectively. Those things are independent of the mind. How do we do it? Reason is the best way. Now, sometimes we can intuit things, sometimes we might just feel things, but ordinarily it's reason that is the reliable path to achieving knowledge of this kind, knowledge that's objective about the world as it is. And then finally, it's acting rationally in response to that objective knowledge that gives us the best chance of progress, the best chance of achieving our aims, the best chance of improving our well-being and attaining our own goals. So those four theses, there are real truths out there about the world that are independent of the mind, that apply universally. We can know at least some of them. We do it by using reason. And if we act rationally in response to that, we can improve the world. That seems to me a basic idea from the Enlightenment that shapes these technological advances throughout the 19th century. But now it does leave us with some problems. And here I want to focus not only on why you might think idealism then has any chance, why did it become popular in the 19th and 20th centuries, but also another more serious problem. So I want to talk about a conflict of images that my own teacher, Wilfrid Sellars, stressed. Sellars was an American philosopher and the son of a famous American philosopher who was concerned with the nature of philosophy and the problem it faced, at least by the 20th century. He describes it this way. The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Now that sounds very vague, but what he really means is that individual sciences study particular things. Sociologists study society. Historians study history, usually of a specific period that they specialize in. A biologist studies life, and so on. The philosopher's job is not to study each of those individual areas, but to construct something like a large-scale map of the world, understanding how they relate to one another. And that's a different sort of project. How does what the biologist says about human beings, for example, relate to what the psychologist says? How does that relate to what the sociologist says and the anthropologist says? And what kind of picture, for example, of a human being emerges from all of that? That's philosophy's job. But he says in doing this, there's a real problem that we face, because it isn't just a matter of figuring out where all of these individual maps go and how to fit them together into a large terrain map, as if we all had the assignment to go out and map a certain area, and now I have to take these puzzle pieces and put them all together. He says, here's the real difficulty. The philosopher is confronted not by one complex, many-dimensional picture, the unity of which, such as it is, he must come to appreciate, but by two pictures of essentially the same order of complexity, each of which purports to be a complete picture of man in the world, and which after separate scrutiny he must fuse into one vision. Let's refer to these two perspectives respectively as the manifest and the scientific images of man in the world. So one of these is the image I have of myself ordinarily, the image I have of myself in experience. And that seems to be the way the world is. When I say perception ordinarily reveals to me the world the way it is, I have in mind the world as I tend to perceive it, the world of ordinary objects. And yet science gives me a very different picture. So I am confronted with these two images. And Sellers is describing here what I'm going to call throughout this course as a two-level theory. There are a lot of these, of various kinds. But the idea is there is some realm of appearances. This is the way things are presented to us. And then there is some hidden realm that explains why things appear are the way they are. So in his concern, that base level, that's the scientific image of the world. That's the image of the world revealed to us by physics, by chemistry, by biology. But then we get the manifest image of the world. That's the world of our ordinary experience. And the idea is that what's happening at that overt macro level depends on what's going on at the micro level. And so both says, I give you a complete depiction of the world, but they're in two totally different languages. One is the language of physics and of mathematics. The other is a language that seems to take ordinary objects, human beings, and so on as basic. And there are many different ways of constructing this. We're going to look at different ways of putting in a scientific image. So we'll look at Marxists or Freudians or a variety of others who say, I've got an idea of what the basic driver of human behavior is. But it can also just be the picture we inherit from the scientific revolution. It's the atomic theory. And so all of these have something in common. There is a surface level to be explained, and then there is a hidden depth level, a deep level that explains what's going on at the surface level. And that idea is one that I think arises, it's already there in the ancient world with ancient atomism, except nobody had any idea how these realms related. Democritus and others could say, the world consists of atoms. We might say, well, maybe, I sure don't see them. And there were no instruments that would reveal them, and nothing really was predicted as a result of this. So it was easy for most people to say, well, whatever, guy, and move on. However, once we have a sophisticated atomic theory, and actually, surprisingly, right around 1750, we get something like a modern theory of chemistry that says, hey, look, these substances actually are made up of the following elements in these combinations, and we can start thinking about atomic structure and explaining what happens at the surface level. On the basis of this, all of a sudden the atomic theory goes from a sort of fruity sideline to the main thing and our main way of understanding the world. Well, why does that advance in the atomic theory that takes place over the 17th and 18th and to some extent 19th centuries transform things so fundamentally? Partly because it does divide the images, because we say, now I have a totally different picture of the world. Partly because I also start thinking, wait a minute, I don't know how to fit this in with my ordinary perceptions of the world. I am ordinarily thinking about things like, let's say hands and clickers and lecterns and a variety of other ordinary objects in the world. But now you're telling me those are made up of these microparticles. They're made up of these atoms, and then the atoms are in turn made up of some atomic particles. And I start realizing, wait, you're telling me that all sorts of aspects of the world that I've been taking for granted, I shouldn't be taking for granted at all. In fact, reality isn't very much like this. I think, aha, this is solid and transparent to a large extent. It looks like I can get to the glass of water that way. I can't. But it's something that appears to have a certain structure to me. And yet you tell me, well, really, what's happening here is there's a certain atomic structure. And as a result of that structure, it appears to have these characteristics. But in fact, for example, it isn't really solid. It's mostly empty space. It just consists of microparticles that are vibrating rapidly and held together with certain forces. And all of a sudden, I start thinking, what you're telling me is the world as I perceive it isn't very much like the way the world really is at all. And once I start following that thought, then that idealist picture starts seeming much more attractive, because I start thinking, wait a minute, so you're telling me that the world as I perceive it is actually really misleading. That's not the way the world is. But then I start thinking, okay, I construct my scientific theories on the basis of that. I could think science is real, and all this that I actually perceive is to some extent an illusion generated by my perceptual and cognitive faculties. Except then I start thinking, but I built science on top of that. So if you're telling me all this is kind of a fiction created by my mind, and then I built science on top of a fiction, shouldn't I think science is a fiction too? Why am I taking it so seriously? And so suddenly that idealist position that everything is mind dependent no longer seems crazy. When you first hear it, it sounds like, well, give me a break. This isn't a construction of my mind, it's really here. But then once you follow this path of thinking about the atomic theory, you think, okay, you're telling me it's not really what it seems. But then my understanding of how it is seems to depend on my understanding of how it seems, in more sophisticated contexts, of course, as we do experiments. And I begin thinking, okay, I don't really understand what's real anymore at all. And that can make me think, okay, maybe everything does depend on the mind. So all of a sudden, first of all, that issue between realists and idealists becomes forefront. It's like, wait a minute, maybe I can really take certain things in the world as independent of the mind, but maybe I can't. All the things I would have thought of as basic, like there is a lectern here, or I'm standing on a floor, or I have a hand, suddenly start seeming suspect. Well, is there really a hand? Maybe they're just a bunch of microparticles connected together through nerve endings and other things with the rest of the body. And all of a sudden, I start thinking all the things I ordinarily think that make up the world aren't real, are instead fictions of my mind. But now I apply that to myself. I think, let's not talk about a lectern or even my hand, but me. Okay, then what arises then is a really acute puzzle about what I could be. How do I make sense of myself as an agent who thinks, who decides, who intends, who acts? I think I do those things. I think I perceive things in a certain way, and I act in a certain way. I form these internal thoughts. I have the emotions. And wait a minute, if I'm just this cloud of microparticles vibrating in certain ways, what do you mean me, right? Descartes says, I think, I am. And after the atomic theory, I start thinking, who's this I? I'm not sure. Maybe it's just this cloud of microparticles doing all this. And I don't know how to make sense anymore of myself as an agent. And in that way, a two-level theory like this really challenges our concept of what it is to be a human being. It implies that we aren't aware of the ultimate explanations of our behavior. I think I am here talking about this because I love talking about ideas and I want to teach this class. But the atomic theorists might say, well, really, I can explain your being here by, well, things, scientific principles that govern air travel and ground transportation. But so really why you're here, well, you know, your brain has a certain structure and there's certain neural firings and they led to this and that and so on and so forth. And the same was true of a lot of other people. And all of a sudden you just get these microparticles interacting. Where are the intentions? Where are the desires? Where are the emotions? Where are the thoughts? They seem gone. And in the end, it suggests you don't really know why you're here. It's ultimately an explanation to be given in terms of neuroscience and ultimately physics. And that's explaining it. So it's all governed by scientific law, by these operations at a micro level that have nothing to do with what you call intentions or thoughts or feelings or perceptions or any of that. Now, how do we fit these visions of ourselves together? One way of looking at it that Sellers is fond of is to talk about a stereoscopic vision. We take these two images and we have to put them together, as in a stereoscope. And when you do that, as a child, I had one of those little things, and it's kind of nice. They go together and they give you this three-dimensional image. So we'd really like to do that with our scientific image of the world and our common sense manifest image of the world. Especially when we turn this toward ourselves, we'd love to be able to get that wonderful three-dimensional picture. But it's not so easy. Let's think about those images a little bit more. The manifest image of man in the world can be characterized in two ways. They're supplementary rather than alternative. First, it's the framework in terms of which man came to be aware of himself as man in the world. Okay, it's the framework in which, to use an existentialist turn of phrase, man first encountered himself, which is when he came to be man. So in other words, the world as we reflect on it and on ourselves. So I think about myself, I become aware of myself, I become aware of myself as a being who thinks and is and feels and acts. And that's one way of thinking about this. Another is to just think about it from a more external point of view. It's the world I ordinarily perceive around myself. It's the world of, well, lecterns and hands and animals, plants, merely material things, rivers, stones, cats, all sorts of things, okay, are the objects that I ordinarily take the world to be part of. And indeed, if I'm not really thinking about science, that's the way I see the world ordinarily. I just think in terms of those macro-level objects. I don't think about their microphysical composition or any of that. But the scientific image arises out of this. Now, at first, and for centuries, science really consisted of just these observations and cataloging the observations. And even if in astronomy people proposed theories to explain planetary motion or other things, nevertheless, they were just pointing to things as they were being observed and trying to systematize those. But the atomic theory did something different. So you start with the manifest image, you start measuring, you start tabulating, trying to find ways of organizing the massive data you're creating through measurement and observation. But then you introduce these theoretical entities, the atoms, the microparticles, genes, or fields, strings, and other things that are unobservable. And all of a sudden you start thinking, they are the things that are really causally active. They're responsible for the world as I perceive it. That's really what explains what's going on at this macro level. And you realize now I'm no longer just organizing the world as I perceive it. I'm doing something different. I'm postulating this different image, this different level of explanation that accounts for it. So in any theory like this, I've got the ordinary observed objects, or myself as I observe myself, if I'm thinking about me, and then I've got these hidden postulated theoretical entities. Now, in the atomic theory, they are the microparticles or other things introduced by science to explain the behavior of objects at the observational level. But it might be something different. In a Marxist theory, for example, of society, it might be economic forces. In Freud's theory, it might be subconscious drives. In another sort of theory, it might be a different kind of motivation. And so I might say, well, really it is not, as Marx thought, class struggle, but it's really a racial struggle or some other kind of thing. And whatever I do there, I'm saying there are these hidden forces, these hidden things that explain what's going on at this level. And throughout the 20th century, people propose different kinds of things to explain things at different levels, often trying to explain social or political phenomena in terms of these other kinds of forces. They usually don't say, oh, well, it's all going to be explained by physics, partly because nothing really follows from that. But on the other hand, lots follows if you think it's all about class struggle or all about subconscious drives. So those things are going to make a difference in a way that maybe this doesn't for how we actually live our lives. But that contrast between the manifest image at the macro level and the scientific image at the micro level, however we interpret it, but especially in that form that it takes as a result of the atomic theory in chemistry and physics, forces us to think, who am I? And makes us no longer convinced we can really understand it. There is, I think, a sharp clash here. So it isn't just like the stereoscopic picture, because there seems to be a contradiction. It's not only that each image says, I'm the real image of the world. And there is that, because each one says, I'm giving you a complete picture of the world. But there is a problem when we turn it to ourselves, because the manifest image says, I am a being who thinks. I make decisions. I form intentions. I act. I decide. I am free. I have free will to decide how I want, and I am under certain kinds of obligations. Some of them are moral obligations. Certain things are right. Certain things are wrong. Some of them are just practical obligations. Like if you want to do this, this is what you should do. And they are, you might say, considerations of rationality. But those things all seem real. They seem significant at the manifest level. On the other hand, at the scientific level, in the scientific image, things are just governed by these laws, generally causal laws. It seems value-free. And it seems like things are either determined, or if you have a certain interpretation of quantum mechanics, then it's determination plus a level of randomness. But okay, it doesn't really change things, whether my mind is determined or whether it's mostly determined, and there are a few dice rolls, doesn't really seem to put me into the picture in any significant way. So am I really free? Well, the manifest image says, sure, you can make a decision about where to eat dinner tonight. The scientific image says, not really. It's all determined already by physical law. And what about moral obligations? Would it be wrong to do such and such? Well, the manifest image says, that's a serious question. You better think about that. The scientific image says, wrong? What do you mean? It'd be as if in a physics class you're learning about the electron and you find out it has a negative charge and somebody says, is that okay? I don't like the fact that these particles are negative. It seems bad. The physicist doesn't have any place for it's good or bad, right? It's just the way it is. And so at the level of physics, all these value questions seem to just disappear. And so am I bound by moral constraints? Am I bound by constraints of rationality? Am I free to make decisions at all? The manifest image says yes, and the scientific image says no. And that seems like a real contradiction. So one way of putting it is this. The manifest image is the surface picture that we have of ourselves. We think of ourselves as free. We act for reasons. We choose things. We make decisions. And we act rightly or wrongly, virtuously or viciously, rationally or irrationally. We take responsibility, or at least we think we ought to take responsibility. We have responsibility for our actions. But in the scientific image, none of that seems to be true. We're determined by something we're not even conscious of. The neurophysiology driving whatever's happening in our brains. Our reasons are mere rationalizations, things our conscious mind tells ourselves to make us feel okay about being pushed around by our neurophysiology. Morality is either nonsense or it reduces to something else. In the next lecture, I'll talk a lot about what happens to morality here and what we could do if we really have this picture of the world. And also, since we're not free, we don't really have any responsibility for anything. And if all that's true, well, then how do we evaluate these conflicting claims of the manifest image and the scientific image to constitute the true and in principle complete account of man in the world? It's not just, hey, here are two different pictures. How do we fit them together? It's really, they seem to give us conflicting pictures. One tells us we are rational agents who make decisions and are under obligations of various kinds. The other says, we're just machines, really, sophisticated machines. And so we get these images that it's very hard to reconcile, not just because they're different, but because they seem really to contradict one another. And if we think hard about where they're contradicting each other, it's not just, oh, my hand seems relatively solid to me, and yet it's really not very solid according to physical theory. It's not that kind of thing. It's really thinking about why we act, the idea of acting for reasons, being under obligations. And so Sellers puts it this way: the irreducibility of the personal is the irreducibility of the ought to the is. In other words, it's what philosophers refer to as normativity, which is a fancy word for just saying, how do we fit moral values into that scientific picture of the world? It seems like fitting me, as I ordinarily understand myself, into that scientific image of the world is a matter of fitting these norms, the ought, a question of right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust, into that picture of the world. For that matter, just rational and irrational into that image of the world. How do we do that? It seems as if there is an irreducibility there. There is just a gap. And that is really where this clash lies. It's at least one place where it lies. It seems to be, in Sellers' view anyway, the central place. So the ought is very real. He says, in the manifest image, I am operating in the space of reasons. But in the scientific image, there are no reasons. This is just the realm of law. Things happen because of laws, the way they happen. Task whether that's good or bad, right or wrong, just or unjust, that's like saying, wow, on an uninhabited planet, there was a volcanic eruption. Good or bad, just happened, okay? There's no such thing. And so the ought, the reasons, the good, the bad, right, wrong, all of that seems missing from the scientific image. And so how do the images, how does the manifest image and the scientific image relate on that question? How do we combine the realm of law with the space of reasons? That, as we'll see next time, is David Hume's question from the Enlightenment. And it remains a critical question. It's something that I think is fundamental and arises naturally from that Enlightenment picture of the world as understood after the scientific revolution. And it's an unavoidable clash. So that is the problem. The scientific image describes the realm of law. The manifest image has us operating in the space of reasons. Maybe those are two different realms, or maybe they have the same realm, but just seen in two different ways. The problem is how we fit them together. And it remains completely unclear how we ought to do that. Thank you.
With the germ theory, how innovation at first is seen as curing or crazy when there is no knowing of what it is. As in, we don't know what we don't know, therefore, how can we act? Then when people are bringing these new concepts, well, obviously it's fear because you don't know what it is. So how do we bridge that? Because we're still seeing it nowadays.
That's a really hard question, because you're right. Often people who innovate in science, and I think it's especially true in medicine, because people's lives are in the balance. In physics, if somebody comes up with a new idea and challenges a traditional theory, okay, people will fight about it, and academic politics sometimes gets quite vicious. I think it was Henry Kissinger who said academic politics is so vicious because there's so little at stake. But sometimes there really is a lot at stake in terms of a scientific theory. Still, it's in medicine and psychology that people really get upset because it does affect people in very direct ways. And here you can understand maybe why people were so bothered by Semmelweis's idea. Partly because it seemed to them obsessive. And to be fair, it wasn't just that, like, you're telling me as a doctor I should be washing my hands all the time. I don't want to do that. What a waste of time, and so on. And because these little things I can't see, it all sounded crazy. But there was also a serious problem. We didn't have any decent ways of sanitizing things back in those days. It wasn't like, oh, use some hand sanitizer or just wash carefully with it. He had them wash in lye. And so their hands came out burning and chapped from this, okay? So the doctors were in pain, and they're like, you're not only telling me I have to do this all the time, but it really hurts, and like my hands are cracking and bleeding. This is not good. And so there was some of that motivation too. But mostly, I think it struck them as bizarrely obsessive compulsive. So in that case, it was especially bad. But you're right, there was a huge resistance because throughout the history of medicine, people had thought in terms of internal humors in the body. And what Semmelweis was suggesting is, it was not just, hey, wash your hands. It was also, you're looking in completely the wrong place for an explanation for disease and for ways of curing it. And that they took as a fundamental challenge. So it's not just when human lives are at stake, it's when whole careers are at stake. You're telling me basically that all of my medical training was garbage and that I've been devoting my life to methods that are useless and maybe counterproductive. And that's a hard thing to swallow. You know, if I come up to somebody who has been at this for decades and thinks of themselves as expert, and I say, you don't know anything, and your entire life has been a complete waste up to now. And I think that's the way they felt. In addition to that, the explanation for the difference in survival rates among the women who had given birth implies, look, you guys were doing it. It wasn't just unfortunate. You guys were killing them by going in after being in the morgue and delivering the babies without washing your hands. And so it wasn't just, hey, your whole career is worthless, but you're actually killing people. Stop it. So that implication, you're really at fault here, I think made them especially resistant. You're right. I mean, in most cases, luckily in science, those kinds of innovations have not been met with that vicious a reaction. And partly because those factors were missing, but partly also because at a certain point, scientists started realizing it's very important to experiment and observe things like this and try to find an explanation for these differentials. But it was really only in the 19th century with John Stuart Mill's work, so right around the middle of the 19th century, in other words, simultaneous with Semmelweis, that Mill actually gave canons of induction to say, here's how you do scientific reasoning. Before that, I think there was a kind of, some people had a sense of it, but there was no real theory of experimentation or learning from experience that would enable people to say, okay, there's a difference here. We need an explanation for the difference and to be open-minded about what it might be.
The way that I see this is I work in the learning and development. So I'm seeing this in the leadership. So when we're training leaders, I say, so this is when I say meeting innovation with wisdom, right? So what is a good approach in training leaders, bringing this knowledge into, hey, you're leading a business. Let's move towards growth and learning with the knowledge that we have and experiences in the history. Look at all of the images that we have. I'm curious to know your point of view.
Okay, good. Leadership is something that does require a degree of open-mindedness, and in particular, open-mindedness not just to other ideas, but to new evidence. I find that a lot of people, a disturbing number of people, I would not have believed it actually, that adults could be like this, but they are, they just get committed to a certain view of the world, and you cannot push them out of it. So to be open enough to say, all right, that's not working out very well. I've got to take that seriously and think about where things are going wrong and how I have to adjust. I think a good leader does that. A bad leader just sticks with the idea and keeps doubling down. And I see a lot of that happening around me in academics, but also in business, in government. People will not admit, maybe I was wrong, maybe I have to adjust my idea. And so it's quite remarkable in a way when a leader actually learns from experience. We're going to look at some thinkers throughout the 20th century who just stick to their guns no matter what, but we're going to see others that keep changing their minds. Albert Camus is going to be a good example of somebody who starts out as a communist, but then sees what Lenin and Stalin do in Russia and says, well, that's not for me, becomes an anarchist and a pacifist, and then the Germans invade France, and he said, well, I guess non-resistance to real aggression is not a good idea either. So he keeps changing his mind, and it might look like flightiness, but I think he's learning from experience. He's saying, here's an idea I think makes sense. Then he looks at the real world, says, I don't think it makes sense. So he changes his mind, and that's a rare quality, it turns out.